Here we go with a quick overview of all US presidents in order, all the way from George Washington right the way up to the current president, Donald Trump. It perhaps goes without saying, but for those not in the know, the presidential system was created in 1789 following the signing of the US Constitution, several years after the end of the 8-year American Revolutionary War of 1775 to 1783. Towards the end of that conflict, the victors had established the Continental Congress to run their new country, with a series of presidents, definitely not kings, at the helm. In 1789, though, after the Founding Fathers realized they had no federal powers to overrule the 13 states and thus raise a national army, they created the new Constitution, and the post of the President of the United States came into being. So, here we go. We start with George Washington, who served from 1789 to 1797. Washington had seen action in his younger days as a member of the Virginia militia. When war with Britain broke out, he was elected Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, forcing the British to surrender and bringing the war to an end. After the war, he helped to formulate the US Constitution, and he was elected the first president. To his dismay, two opposing factions emerged during his tenure, which would shape future US politics. One side, led by Alexander Hamilton, argued for a strong central government. Another, led by Thomas Jefferson, favored decentralizing power to the states. Washington was replaced by his vice president, John Adams. Adams' presidency was dominated by the question of who the US should support in the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, their old foes Britain or France, who were now at war following the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. Washington had elected to stay out of the conflict, even though France had helped the US defeat the British. Despite this, for some reason France perceived the US to be on the British side, and they started seizing American merchant ships. Adams sent a peace commission to France, which resulted in the French snubbing the Americans and demanding a huge bribe. The incident, dubbed the XYZ affair, turned France from a potential ally into an enemy, and US ships began attacking French vessels in the Caribbean. Next came Thomas Jefferson, who'd served as vice president under John Adams. During his presidency, the 1803 Louisiana Purchase was completed, almost doubling the size of the US. Louisiana in those days stretched from modern-day Louisiana in the Gulf of Mexico all the way through the centre of the continent up to the modern-day Canadian border. The land had originally been claimed by France, but they sold it to the US to raise money to fight the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. The US also waged war on North African pirates, who'd harassed American ships and enslaved US sailors in the First Barbary War. Fourth President, James Madison, was acclaimed the father of the Constitution for the contribution he made in helping to frame both that and the Bill of Rights. In the years leading up to Madison's term, the British had been irritating the US. They'd imposed trade restrictions to stop them doing business with France, forced US sailors into service with their Royal Navy, and had supported indigenous peoples in their fight against the newly formed US. Hoping to restore US honour and gain land in Canada, Madison declared war on the British in 1812. Though the British defeated US forces in several skirmishes, and even attacked Washington and set fire to the White House, the war's result was ultimately inconclusive, though future President Andrew Jackson's victory at New Orleans convinced the Americans that they'd been victorious. James Monroe was next, a former soldier who'd fought against the British in the American War of Independence, and later a special envoy serving under Thomas Jefferson. He'd helped negotiate the Louisiana Purchase. As president, he admitted Missouri as a slave state, but also banned slavery in northern territories. He loaned his name to both the US policy of opposing European re-expansion in the Americas and to a new capital city set up by freed African slaves, hence the Monroe Doctrine and Monrovia in Liberia. Another notable event under Monroe's watch was that Spain sold Florida to the US under the 1819 Adams-Onis Treaty. The son of the second president, John Adams, John Quincy Adams, had served as Secretary of State under Monroe, perhaps one of the most travelled early presidents. He'd also served in several diplomatic positions across the world. Thanks to opposition in Congress, the sixth president struggled to achieve anything beyond his proposition of a new network of roads and canals across the United States. Adams made more of an impact after his presidency as a member of the House of Representatives, advancing civil liberties by winning a case before the Supreme Court, which resulted in rights being granted to former slaves who had taken over a ship called the Amistad. A former lawyer, slave owner and war hero who had defeated the British at New Orleans during the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson became the seventh president in 1829. Jackson believed more power should lie with individual states, though conversely, he reinforced central power because unlike previous presidents, who had only vetoed bills that they considered unconstitutional, Jackson vetoed ones that he just didn't like. He broke up the National Bank and opposed the Supreme Court's decision to allow indigenous people to remain on their land. In 1835, someone tried to shoot him dead. Rather than ducking, the president tried to beat his would-be assassin to death with his cane. King Jackson, as his opponents dubbed him, left office in 1837, but not before the Whig Party had been established to oppose him. Martin Van Buren had served as vice president under Andrew Jackson. Using his inaugural address to boast about how the American experiment was an example to the rest of the world, within months the country was plunged into an economic depression, the Panic of 1837, that would last 6 years. On the one hand, Van Buren gets credit for rejecting the annexation of slaveholding territory Texas, though this was also to avoid war with Mexico, but he loses points for forcing indigenous tribes into internment camps. Apparently Van Buren is one of those presidents Americans know least about, with some struggling to even name him as a president. If that's the case, it's likely even fewer would be able to remember his successor, William Henry Harrison. Harrison, the last president to have been born a British subject, had spent much of his younger days fighting indigenous tribes in the Northwest Territories before turning his attention to Washington politics. Then as now, with Harrison being put forward as a humble, down-to-earth, cider-drinking candidate in the 1840 election, despite coming from a wealthy slave-owning family, in contrast to his opponent Martin Van Buren, who was portrayed as a champagne-sipping socialite. On the day of his inauguration, Harrison chose to deliver a long speech, braving the wet and chilly weather without an overcoat or hat. As a result, he caught a fever and died 32 days later, the first of 8 presidents to die in office. Following Harrison's death, his vice president, John Tyler, was elevated to the office, which resulted in him being referred to as His Excellency. As president, he soon found himself without a party, when the Whigs expelled him for vetoing their plans to set up a national bank to deal with the ongoing economic crisis. Tyler's plan to annex Texas as a slave state would upset the balance between the states in the South and the free states in the North. This imbalance would set the states on a collision course that would end with the Civil War. Tyler is frequently cited as one of the worst presidents on this list because of his decision 16 years after the end of his term to support the Confederacy during the American Civil War, even going so far as serving as a member of the Confederacy's Provisional Congress. Aside from helping to lay the foundations of the Civil War, Tyler is also the president who has a grandson who, as of November 2024, is still alive. Harrison Ruffin Tyler was born in 1928, fathered by one of Tyler's children, Lyon, who was born in 1853, 9 years before the 10th president himself died. James Polk was next, taking office in 1845. Polk is known for overseeing a huge expansion of the size of the United States. In 1848, he settled an agreement with the British to absorb Oregon Territory into the Union. He had also set his sights on California and the southwestern territories. The US offered to buy the territory from Mexico, but war broke out in 1846. When Mexico resisted the US's overtures, the Mexican-American War was a resounding victory for the US. California and the southwestern states were absorbed into the Union in return for giving the Mexican government $15 million. The 12th president was an army general who'd fought against the British in 1812 and the Mexicans in 1846. By 1848, long-standing problems with the Union were coming to the fore, with northern abolitionist states opposing the expansion of slavery into newly absorbed California and the southwestern territories, in direct opposition to the aspirations of slave-owning southern states. Into this mix came Zachary Taylor, who was popular with northerners because of his war record, albeit someone from a large slave-owning family. No one really knew much about his politics. On the one hand, he appeared to support Southerners by allowing new territories to decide themselves whether or not to allow slavery. On the other hand, when Southern leaders threatened to leave the Union, he told them he would personally lead the army south and hang them. Taylor's tenure was cut short 16 months after his inauguration, when he died unexpectedly. Serving initially as vice president, Millard Fillmore was elevated to the seat of power on the death of Zachary Taylor. As such, it fell to him to try and solve the fundamental issues which had continued to crystallize under his predecessor. His solution was to support the Compromise of 1850. On the one hand, California was admitted to the Union a free state, and the slave trade was abolished in the District of Columbia. On the other, the Fugitive Slave Act was introduced, mandating the return of escaped slaves, something Northerners hated. The compromise would result in a very short-term truce over the issue of the expansion of the slave trade. Franklin Pierce is listed as one of the worst presidents in history for supporting the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which effectively set the ball in motion for the Civil War. The Kansas-Nebraska Act underlined the principle that individual states, especially the new ones which were in the process of being formed, should be free to decide whether or not to allow slavery. Northerners were horrified, fearing that a flood of new slave states would upset the balance of power in the US, which could in turn eventually lead to them being forced to allow slavery in their northern states. In response, a new Republican Party was formed, with Abraham Lincoln at its helm. The chess pieces of the forthcoming American Civil War were slowly moving themselves into position. Aside from all that, And despite his reputation as a bad president, Pierce cuts a rather tragic figure. Yes, he was an alcoholic who drank himself to death. This is perhaps not surprising, given that his wife suffered from depression and all of their children died young, his last remaining son being horribly killed in a train accident shortly before his inauguration. If Pierce was bad, wait till you hear about the next guy. Frequently named as the worst president ever, Buchanan was president during the period which led up to the Civil War. The split between the southern slave states and the northern free states was growing more and more bitter. Instead of acting decisively, Buchanan hoped a compromise would be reached somehow, whereby both sides would just live and let live, but the nation was expanding westwards, and both sides were determined that any new states should support their position. If either side was suddenly in a significant minority, slavery could either be abolished or expanded. At this point in history, the US needed a strong, decisive leader, not a Buchanan. This lack of action extended to the very last days of his term, when southern states, fearing the consequences of the increasingly inevitable election of a decisive leader in the shape of anti-slavery Republican Abraham Lincoln, started to secede from the Union. Abraham Lincoln is perhaps one of the most famous of all presidents. He's certainly the most popular, having led the US through the Civil War, in which the Union was almost torn apart. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, 7 years ago, came to be seen as one of the greatest and most influential speeches in American history. At the height of the war, in 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that slaves who were in rebellion were free. The war ended in victory for the Unionists. Lincoln was famously re-elected for a second term at the war's end, but he was murdered shortly afterwards by an assassin as he was sitting in a theatre in Washington, D.C. The 17th president, Andrew Johnson, was vice president at the time of Lincoln's murder, so like others before and after him, graduated to the position. He was the president charged with helping to lead the reconstruction of the US following the Civil War. He also became the first president to be impeached after removing a protected public worker from office, and he also oversaw the purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867. Famous for his role in leading the Unionist army to victory in the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant went on to serve 2 terms as president. Though a popular go-getting soldier, he proved a less competent commander-in-chief, allowing Congress to dominate his time in office. He did, however, get the 15th Amendment ratified, allowing black men to vote, and he also gave military protection to black people in the South and oversaw the country's reunification. The next president attempted to heal the wounds of the Civil War by withdrawing troops from the South, although this resulted in racist Democrat local governments emerging instead. The South, though now reconciled to the Union, nevertheless embraced segregation, a state of affairs that would stand well into the next century and beyond. Hayes was also known for introducing civil service reforms, which meant appointments were made on merit, not on who you knew. He was succeeded by James Garfield, another Civil War veteran who had fought for the Union and who had served in Congress for many years. Garfield continued Hayes's reforms against corruption, but his presidency was cut short when he was shot by an assassin. Despite hanging on for several weeks, and in spite of efforts by Scottish telephone inventor Alexander Graham Bell to find the bullet using a metal detector, doctors then simply didn't have the knowledge they needed to keep him alive. Garfield died at the end of 1881, becoming the second president to be assassinated, just 16 years after the first, Abraham Lincoln. Vice President Chester Arthur succeeded the murdered Garfield. In a previous life as collector of the Port of New York, Chester Arthur had supported a system of handing out government jobs for political favours, but when he became president, he surprised everyone by opposing that same system and advocating for civil service reform. He also supported lower tariffs to ensure the government didn't accumulate a surplus. Grover Cleveland was next. He's both the 22nd and the 24th president, serving initially from 1885 to 1889, and then again from 1893 to 1897. He was the first Democrat president to serve after the Civil War. The last had been James Buchanan, 25 years earlier. He was initially elected with the support of Republicans, some of whom were unhappy with their own candidate's record. Though he was swept from power and replaced by a Republican president, a rocky economy led to him being brought back for a second term. Cleveland presided over a US experiencing a grave economic depression, during which unemployment rocketed. When a rail strike threatened to interfere with the mail delivery, Cleveland authorized federal troops to break it up using force. This angered many Northern Democrats, resulting in the party becoming divided and enabling Republicans to dominate the early 20th century. Benjamin Harrison was the grandson of the 9th US president, William Henry Harrison, who you'll remember died after just 32 days in office. The second President Harrison was responsible for expanding the US Navy and is famous for his plans to annex Hawaii. In the midst of an economic depression, Harrison signed off on the McKinley tariff, which placed high duties on imported goods. The intention was meant to help domestic producers. Instead, consumer prices rocketed. He also helped to increase the money supply, causing inflation. The economy tanked even more and Harrison was kicked out. As mentioned previously, he was replaced by his predecessor, Grover Cleveland, Ireland in 1892. McKinley is the third of 4 US presidents who would be assassinated. In office, he supported colonial uprisings against Spain, resulting in the Spanish-American War, an 8-month conflict with the Spanish Empire, which resulted in Cuban independence and the US gaining control of the Philippines, Guam and Puerto Rico. Having fired up American nationalism with these victories, McKinley was re-elected, but he was shot 6 months into his second term. After McKinley died, his vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, was sworn in. Aged just 42, he's the youngest president to have held office, and he served 2 terms. Roosevelt was an energetic man who created the Square Deal, a domestic program that improved rights for workers, protected the natural environment, created consumer, health and welfare reforms, and regulated business more closely. He oversaw the building of the Panama Canal, and he won a Nobel Prize for mediating peace between Russia and Japan. Roosevelt was succeeded by William Taft. Whereas Roosevelt felt that a president should use any means possible to achieve his goals, as long as it didn't break any laws, Taft was a stickler for following established conventions. Taft oversaw the introduction of income tax, tried to lower tariffs, and strengthened US trade with South America. After serving, he was eventually appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a position he much preferred, to the extent that he once said he could barely remember his time as president. Woodrow Wilson would serve 2 terms next as the 28th US president. Wilson reduced tariffs, established the Federal Reserve, and tightened regulation on big business. He also took the US into World War I, declaring that the US had a moral duty to make the world safe for democracy. After the war, he pushed for the establishment of the League of Nations in a bid to stop future wars. Wilson had wanted to seek a 3rd term of office, but was forced to retire after a stroke. The 29th president is one of the least popular, partly because of his self-confessed lack of interest in the office, but mostly because of the corruption that engulfed him. That said, Warren G. Harding is remembered for some good things, such as promoting racial harmony, freeing political prisoners, and setting up healthcare centres for pregnant women and their children that reduced child mortality. Sadly for him, though, he's best remembered for scandal and corruption, thanks to the crooks he surrounded himself with and appointed to key positions. One scandal stands above others. It turned out that a member of Harding's cabinet had taken bribes from oilmen in exchange for allowing them to drill at a reserve oil site for the US Navy, the Teapot Dome in Wyoming. Harding died suddenly of a heart attack in 1923. In San Francisco. With Harding gone, his vice president Calvin Coolidge took over as the 30th Commander-in-Chief. Coolidge embodied his famous quote, "The chief business of the American people is business," by cutting taxes and easing commercial regulations. But this lack of oversight would of course contribute to the 1929 Wall Street crash, which happened just after he left office. Before becoming Commander-in-Chief, the 31st President Herbert Hoover had presided over the US's stunning economic growth in the Roaring Twenties as Secretary of Commerce. During his 1 term in office, Hoover had to grapple with the economic and social effects of the Great Depression. Sadly for those suffering the effects, Hoover resisted efforts to get the federal government to intervene, arguing that poverty was a local and voluntary matter. Instead, his focus was firmly on helping business and farmers and expanding public works in a bid to boost employment. As a result of these failed efforts, Hoover was kicked out of office and replaced by Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933. Roosevelt enacted a series of laws to boost the economy and jobs. The visible poverty people suffered during the Depression had left an indelible mark, and it led to the introduction of the Social Security Act, which was designed to help the unemployed and retirees. These measures were labelled the New Deal, though the economy still hadn't fully recovered by the outbreak of World War II. Despite this, Roosevelt was elected an astonishing 4 times in 1932, 36, 40, and 44. Despite, or perhaps because, he energetically led the US into war against the Germans and the Japanese, Roosevelt died of a stroke before the final victory in 1945. Roosevelt's unexpected death elevated his vice president, Harry Truman, to the White House. It was Truman who took the decision to drop 2 nuclear bombs on Japan, precipitating the end of the war, and, conveniently, stopping the Soviet Union invading Japan. He also oversaw the rebuilding of Europe with the Marshall Plan, generously loaning European countries billions of dollars to help rebuild after the war. The 33rd president oversaw the earliest years of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and he even went as far as involving US troops in the Korean War to stop the spread of communism in Asia. A former US Army general, Eisenhower had helped to oversee victory in Europe against the German Nazi regime, before serving as the first ever commander of NATO. Ike, as he was styled, supported the working man by reinforcing and even expanding Roosevelt's New Deal, and he also sent troops to the southern states to enforce the desegregation of schools. In foreign affairs, he ended the Korean War, but beefed up the fight against communism by giving the CIA a free hand in disrupting the domestic affairs of unfriendly foreign countries. Eisenhower was followed by one of the most legendary presidents in the modern era, John F. Kennedy, who was the second youngest commander-in-chief to take office. Perhaps the most famous event of his tenure is the Cuban Missile Crisis, with World War III almost breaking out after the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles there. JFK became the fourth president to be assassinated whilst in office, after he was shot to death in Dallas. He was succeeded by his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, who ensured Kennedy's Civil Rights Act was taken forward. LBJ also introduced a series of social programs for medical care, housing, education and transport. Sounds like a good guy, right? Well, he also massively escalated the conflict in Vietnam, the losses for which came to be blamed personally on him. Thanks to this rising unpopularity, Johnson didn't seek a second term, and he was replaced by Richard Nixon in the White House. Assisted by his foreign policy advisor, Henry Kissinger, Nixon shaped the course of the Cold War, resetting relations with China and overseeing arms control agreements with the Soviet Union. Back at home, many of his domestic policies were blocked by Congress. His presidency ended in disgrace, with him resigning in 1974 after the Watergate scandal. Very much the post-Nixon president, Ford proved unpopular for pardoning his predecessor and presiding over the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Domestically, he tried to buoy the economy with tax cuts and increased federal spending before losing to his successor, Jimmy Carter. Former peanut farmer Jimmy Carter came to Washington as an outsider, and as such struggled to get much past Congress as president. Though he was a folksy, popular commander-in-chief initially, his reputation took a dive, with the public seeing him as an ineffective leader, especially given that his term in office was characterized by rising inflation, oil prices, and unemployment. He was succeeded by former actor and California governor, Ronald Reagan, who stood by two policies: shrink the government and cut taxes. The latter, tax cuts, came about, leading to a huge boost in the US economy. The former, smaller government, didn't. Hardly helped by Reagan's commitment to huge increases in weapons spending, as the US upped the ante to combat Soviet communism. Reagan's popularity soared when he almost became the fifth president to be assassinated, and he went on to serve 2 terms. Former CIA director and vice president George Bush was next. The Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union collapsed during his tenure, ending the decades-long Cold War and initiating a new global era. Bush drove Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait when he invaded in 1990. Domestically, Bush promised no new taxes, but had to renege on that to help thaw the economy. Lacking Reagan's charm, Bush served just 1 term before being replaced by Bill Clinton. Former Arkansas governor and Democrat, Clinton was popular initially, but lost control of Congress to the Republicans when he tried to introduce universal health care. Nevertheless, he still managed to overhaul the welfare system and win a second term. However, his term in office was tainted by accusations of perjury and his impeachment, though he was ultimately acquitted. Clinton was followed by George W. Bush, the 41st president's son. Bush's entire presidency was dominated by the September the 11th attacks and the subsequent US invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. Domestically, he rallied Americans, now terrified of terrorism, around the Patriot Act, which massively expanded the powers of the military and security services. Barack Obama made history by becoming the first black president. Faced with the fallout of the 2008 financial crisis, he acted to increase federal support to boost the economy, and he made healthcare more accessible. He also ramped up drone strikes on targets across the Middle East as part of the US's ongoing war on terror. Obama served 2 terms before stepping down. He was succeeded by Donald Trump, who renegotiated trade agreements with foreign powers and who became the first US president to meet with North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un. Trump's other policies included more stringent border and immigration controls, criminal justice reform, and the reduction of prescription drug prices. The remainder of Trump's presidency was consumed by dealing with the emerging COVID-19 pandemic. Barack Obama's former vice president, Joe Biden, came next. Though Biden's physical and mental fitness for the role was soon in question, he pushed on through his 4 years, overseeing measures to reduce healthcare costs and massively increasing military spending in support of Ukraine in its war with Russia. And that brings us to the current US president, the 47th to serve, Donald Trump. Which president is your favourite? Which one do you think is the worst? Let us know in the comments below.